Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. In this video, we are going to see how to secure the APIs that are exposed in a Spring Boot app using the AWS Cognito OAuth2 scopes. So before going into the step-by-step configuration of how to build a Spring Boot app from scratch and then secure its APIs using AWS Cognito OAuth2 scopes. Let's quickly go through this very basic diagram so that you will understand how the end-to-end flow works. So if you look at the very first step, you have a client application, and that client application can be any app. It can be a UI app, a front-end app, or it can be a back-end client application, which is calling APIs. Or it can be a mobile app which is calling APIs that are exposed in a Spring Boot app. So it can be any application. So the client app is basically the client which is calling the APIs that are exposed by the Spring Boot app. And when this client application is calling the APIs exposed in Spring Boot app, it needs to pass a token which will be validated by the Spring Boot app in order to allow or deny access. So the way this flow works is the client app will first call the Cognito token endpoint using the client credentials grant, which is one of the OAuth 2.0 grants. And you can go and check the OAuth 2 spec for this grant and go through all the flows. So when the client app calls this Cognito token endpoint using the client credentials grant, it will get a JWT access token, and then it can pass this access token in the header to the Spring Boot APIs, and Spring Boot will validate the token in the step number 4 and also the scope. And then based on the validation, if all the validations are successful, then it will return the response, API response, with a HTTP 200. But if the token is invalid, or if the token already expired, then the Spring Boot application will return a HTTP 401 response. At the same time, if the token is valid, but the token doesn't have enough permissions to call the API. So for example, the client application is having a valid token, but it is not allowed to access one of the APIs that is hosted in the Spring Boot app. Like for example, let's say there is a get user API and there is a write user API, but the client application is allowed to call only get user but not write user. So when it passes the token to the Spring Boot app, the token will be valid, but the point is the token doesn't have permissions to call that write API. So what Spring Boot app will do in that case is basically it will return a 403 forbidden error. So we will look at all these scenarios. Like we are going to build this entire app from scratch, and we are going to provision a new Cognito user pool for this app and see how to configure the client app in the Cognito user pool, and then call the APIs that are hosted in the Spring Boot app. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the AWS console, the Cognito service, where I will be creating a totally new Cognito user pool. And for the Java Spring Boot app, I'm going to use the Spring Tool Suite IDE. And you are free to use any IDE that you are comfortable with, like Eclipse, IntelliJ, or any other IDE that supports Spring framework. I use this IDE because it comes from the Spring framework world, and it has very good support for Spring Boot projects. So now let's start with the very first step of creating a Cognito user pool. And then we will go ahead and create a client application, the Spring Boot application using the Spring Tool Suite, and then see how to secure those APIs using Cognito scopes. So let's create a new user pool. I am not going to go through each and every configuration available in this Spring Boot in this Cognito user pool. You can explore that later. Let's quickly create a basic user pool that is required for this integration. So select username, go to next. We don't need MFA for these use cases. Uh, Disable this, go to next, disable this, disable. Just select this one just to go to the next screen. And now we need to enter a user pool name. I am going to name it as SpringBoot Cognito RS, which means resource server. And we don't really need a hosted UI in this case, but let's just select it. That's fine. Sorry, I will take it back. We actually need the hosted UI because hosted UI is the one which supports all the OAuth2 service endpoints. So we need to select hosted UI. And let's name it as spcog.rs. Yes, it is available. So you can give any name here as long as it is available. So if it is not available, just try typing cogrs1, cogrs2, whatever you want. And now let's actually create a confidential client. Name it as sbcog client, and we need a client secret. And let's go to the advanced app client settings. Let's leave all these things as is because we are not going to use this client anyway. I'm going to create a totally new client. So let's leave this client, just give some dummy URL here for callback URLs because I think it will throw an error if you don't give an URL. Click next, review all the settings, create the user pool. So this is the user pool that we created. You can go to the app integration tab. You can check that Cognito domain. You can even see the client that got created. But anyway, ignore this client. We are not going to use it. I'm going to create a totally new client so that you will understand each and every step when we create a new client for securing the APIs. So now let's go to the Spring Tool suite and start creating a new project from scratch and expose an API through the Spring Boot app and then see how to secure that API. I already have a project. I'm not going to use it. I'm going to create it from a scratch. So before creating the project, let's actually open the Spring Boot OAuth2 security docs. So just search for Spring Boot OAuth2 security in Google. And this is the link which explains all the OAuth2 security features that are available in Spring Boot out of the box. So in this case, we are going to look at how to secure the APIs. So we need to use this OAuth2 resource server capabilities that are available in Spring Boot. And we are going to use this JWT option, which actually uses the OAuth2 scopes. So let's actually go through these steps. I will create a totally new project from scratch. So let me actually, I will switch my workspace. So I will create a totally new workspace called cogrs demo. So as I said earlier, you are free to use any IDE as long as that IDE supports Java Spring Boot development. You are free to use any IDE, whichever you are comfortable with. You have to just make sure that all the Spring Boot libraries that are required for this particular project is properly added in the Maven configuration file. I'm going to use the Maven build. So let's see how to do that. So from this IDE, select create new Spring Starter project. Name that project as spcog.rs. Select Maven, go to next, and here select search for security, and let's select Spring Security OAuth2 client, OAuth2 resource server, and search for web. and select Spring Web. Finish. And this will create a totally new project from scratch. And let's see what all things are created. So it created a main application class, which you can see here. And this is the main Spring Boot application class. It also created an application.properties by default. Let's actually change the extension to application.yaml. Excuse me. Uh, so you can use application.properties or application.yaml format. I am comfortable with the YAML format, so I am renaming it as YAML. If you're comfortable with the properties format, that is also fine. So now let's go ahead and create an API in this Spring Boot application. So how do you create a API? So let's create a totally new class called user controller. So in order to expose an API in Spring Boot, you need to annotate that class with REST controller. So if you type REST controller and you can import. Yeah, so you can import REST controller. So once you annotated a class with REST controller, I will actually remove one. You can create methods like this and that will automatically get exposed as an API. So I'm going to create an method called get user. These are just going to be dummy APIs. I'm not going to add too much of business logic here. So the way I'm going to do is just I'm going to return a message called access granted reading user details, right? And I'm going to make it as a get API and I'm going to give the path as slash get user. So this is an API. So here you can add any business logic you want, like reading from a DB based on some parameter that is passed, etc. I am not going to go into all those details because the main goal of this video is to see how to secure this API. So now let's actually see what happens. Let's start this application. So right click this main application class and run it as a Java application. So the application started in port 8080 and I'm going to use Chrome, Postman for testing this. So if I go to http://localhost:8080 get user, click send, I get a 401 unauthorized, which means this API is already secured. But we don't know which token is used for securing this API. That is something we need to still configure in this application.yaml, but this API is already secured by default. And you know why it happens? That is because of these dependencies. When you add Spring Boot security dependencies to your Maven pom.xml, by default, it secures all the endpoints in your application. Now let's see what happens. Let me actually comment out all these some of these security related dependencies and just see what happens. We will anyway revert it back. This is just for your understanding that I'm doing it, but we will revert all these comments. Like we are not going to comment it permanently. So I commented all the OAuth2 and security related dependencies and I have only the web dependency here. Let's restart this application and try to access the same API and see what happens. Now when I access, it gives me a 200 response with whatever message we written in that API, which is access granted reading user details. So this is the beauty of the Spring framework. I'm going to uncomment all these things, undoing all these things. So it automatically secures all the endpoints the moment you add these security related dependent libraries. And now I get a 401. Okay, so now let's go ahead and configure the Cognito related details in this application.yaml so that this particular API will be secured using the Cognito OAuth2 token that is generated using the user pool that we created in this very first step. But before doing that, we need to create some configuration in this Cognito user pool. So let's quickly do that. So in order to create custom scopes in Cognito user pool, you need to create a resource server. Like custom scopes is basically the OAuth 2.0 scopes. So let's call this resource server. So this resource server actually represents the API that we are building in the Spring Boot app. So let's name it as Spring Boot, which is SB user API. And let's give an identifier called Spring Boot user API. And let's add a custom scope called read user and description as read user details and create the resource server. So the resource server got created, SB user API. Now let's create a client, confidential client, and let's name it as SB user client. And you need to select generate a client secret in case it's not selected by default. And let's go to the OAuth to grant type and select client credentials. And for the custom scopes, select the SB user API slash read user. And if you try to create, actually it will give an error. That is because the callback URL is a mandatory field, but anyway it is not used. So just give some dummy URL here and create the app client. So the SB user client app got created in Cognito. Now the next step is to see how to get a token using these client application credentials. So in order to do that, go to Cognito token endpoint documentation, search in Google for Cognito token endpoint, and the very first link takes you to the token endpoint. And here you can go through the details like what all parameters you need to pass to the OAuth 2 token endpoint in Cognito. I will quickly explain how to do that using Chrome. So in order to call this OAuth 2 token endpoint, we need the Cognito's domain. So this is the domain in my user pool. In your user pool, it will be a totally different domain because it is unique per user pool. So copy this domain, change this to post, paste it here, go back to the documentation, copy this slash OAuth2 token, append it to this domain. So now we need to actually pass certain parameters in order to get a access token using client credential stack. The very first, and these are all based on OAuth 2.0 spec, which you can go through you can search in Google and go through the spec. So you need to pass grant type. So select body X for www form URL encoded, grant type as client underscore credentials. And for the client ID secret, go to the authorization tab in your Postman and select basic auth. And I'm going to delete the old ones. And let's again go back to my Cognito user pool. And this is the SB user client. Just we will verify it once. Yeah, this is the one. Copy the client ID and copy the client secret. And that's all. We need to just pass a grant type as client credentials and then the authorization header and then hit this URL and you will get an access token. So you can check this access token details. Go to jwt.io and do this. So you can see the token details here, and here is the scope, read user. So now we have the token. Now what we need to do is go back to the Spring documentation, and here you can see, in order to specify the issuer, the token issuer details in the Spring Boot application YAML file, you need to specify these parameters in the Spring Boot application YAML file. So copy this, go here and just paste it here. The only thing we need to modify here is the issuer URI. So this issuer URI should point to the Cognito user pools issuer URI, which is my Cognito user pools issuer URI. So now let's see how to get that issuer URI value from my Cognito user pool. So again, go back to Cognito documentation, and here select hosted UI endpoints reference. Sorry, federation endpoints reference, and copy this well-known OpenID configuration, paste it here, and we need to replace certain values like region and your user pool ID. So my user pool ID is here, copy it, replace, and my region is US-East-1. If you have created your user pool in a different region, just make sure you give that particular region here, otherwise it won't work. So now press enter. So you get certain attributes here like issuer, authorization endpoint, all those things. So copy this issuer, go back to your Spring application and paste it here. That's it. So the end-to-end setup is done. It looks very simple, but that's the beauty of Spring Boot framework, that it does many of these things which we saw in this diagram, like validating the token, all those things is automatically done by the Spring Boot framework. You just need to specify the issuer URI in your application YAML and pass the token that is generated but by that particular issuer, which is my Cognito user pool, and then it will like magically do all the authorizations. It will perform all the security checks and make sure your API is secure. Now let's restart this application, and let's go back to my Postman. Again, hit that same API, and I should get a 401, which is expected. Now go to headers and pass that access token, which is generated by my Cognito user pool in the authorization header. So the way you need to pass is, in the value you need to specify bearer space that access token value. Now when I hit, I get the user details. You know how? That is because Spring Boot app is now accepting this access token that is generated by this particular Cognito user pool, because I configured that Cognito user pool's issuer URI here. Let's just try a different thing. So for example, here I said if you pass an invalid token, it will give a 401 error, right? So in this token, just delete one of the characters so that it will become invalid. Let's see what happens. You get a 401 unauthorized error. That is because it's an invalid token. Now I undo that change and again click send. I get a grant reading user details. So now the API is secure. Like whatever API you built here is now secured. Now let's do a minor enhancement to this particular logic and see what happens. So right now it is only checking the token. It is not checking whether this particular token is allowed to access get user API or not. In order to do that, we need to actually add a scope related check. So if you look at this token, there is a attribute in the token called scope, which says this token is allowed to call read user API. We are not checking this right now in this Spring Boot configuration. The only thing that is currently being validated is whether the token is valid or not. It doesn't check whether the token has the permissions to call this API. So in order to implement that, if you go back to this documentation again and search for pre-authorize, and here you can see you can add an annotation in Spring called pre-authorize and specify which scope is required to call that particular API. So, but before even doing that, you need to enable the method level security checks in your Spring Boot application. So in order to do that, here in the documentation, somewhere in the documentation, so if you open this OAuth2 client, or maybe OAuth2 login, no, sorry, I think authorization. Yeah, in authorization, select method security. You need to add this annotation in your Spring Boot app. So copy this annotation, go back to your application, add it, and make sure you import it. So the class got imported here, save it. Now go back to your controller and again go back to your previous page and add this pre-authorize. Again, make sure you import it. And in our case, the scope is actually this one, SB user API / read user. Now stop it, run it, and let's see what happens. It will still work, but I will show you like what happens if it doesn't work. So I'm still getting the user details because the token that I am passing has this particular scope. Now let's do one more thing. Let's make it more interesting. So let's actually create a new API called write user. And I'm going to just return this message called writing user details and copy these two things. Generally, write user is a post mapping. So let's actually make it a post mapping, import it, and let's call it update user. And let's actually change the scope to update user. Okay. So now let's restart the application and see what happens. So let me again call the same get user API. I am getting the response. Let's right click, duplicate this request, change it to post update user. So I duplicated the request, so it used that same authorization header, and let's try calling that API again. See what I'm getting now, 403 forbidden. So if you look at this diagram again, this is the 5C scenario. So basically what happens here is, if I call get user, oh sorry, if I call get user, I'm getting the user details using that same access token. But if I try to call write user, I'm getting a 403 forbidden error using that same access token. The reason is because the access token that I am passing doesn't have the scope, which is update user. And that is the reason why you are seeing a 403 forbidden error. If the token itself is invalid, you will see a 401 error. But in this case, the token is valid, but it doesn't have enough permissions to call that write user API. That's why you are seeing a 403 forbidden error. Now, let's quickly go ahead and add a new scope, update user details, and let's actually add that scope here. So I added both the scopes to this user client, this app client, and let's get a totally new token, access token here. And let's check this access tokens scopes in jwt.io. Now I have both the scopes, and let's see what happens. Now when I call get user, I still get the user details. Now when I call update user, it should work. Yes, now update user also works. That is because the new token that I generated has both the scopes and it has permissions to call both the APIs. So this is how you do the end-to-end configuration on to secure a API that is exposed by a Spring Boot app using AWS Cognito OAuth2 scopes. So I there are lots of steps involved. So if you face any issues, please feel free to add a comment in the YouTube video, and I will respond to you. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thank you.